Hey guys, it's Libby. Sound Politics is about to get started. But Scott, we recorded this episode during kind of a pivotal moment this morning, and things have changed. As they say, the news environment has evolved since we had this conversation. Something big has changed. What happened?
Yeah, so a federal judge in Seattle has temporarily blocked President Trump's attempt to rescind birthright citizenship. We'll get into what that means in this episode, but basically it's, the idea in the 14th Amendment of the Constitution that every person born in the United States is an American citizen. Our U.S. District Court Judge John KUOW on Thursday this morning, right as we were taping, said from the bench that I can't remember another case where the question presented is as clear as this one is. This is a blatantly unconstitutional order. And, in his time on the bench, KUOW is a Ronald Reagan appointee. He also said there are other times in world history where we look back and people of goodwill can say, where were the judges? Where were the lawyers?
It was a real verbal smackdown of the Justice Department attorney. We are going to get into what the birthright citizenship executive order means for Washington State. Just wanted to make that note that has changed since we recorded. But here's this week's episode of Sound Politics. Scott, did you see that Bob Ferguson got Jesse Jones to be the director of Results Washington, this agency that looks at making state agencies more efficient and transparent and stuff?
And I know who Jesse Jones is, but I feel like I don't understand because I didn't grow up here or haven't watched him on TV for decades. Like, I don't understand who Jesse Jones is.
Legend, in one word, legend. Like one of the best branding of any local television personality in history, I think. This is like, if you have been screwed over, somehow scammed, bilked out of money, you feel like you got a bad raw deal, you get Jesse. And he'll fix it for you. And this is embedded in my brain growing up here in the Pacific Northwest. Like, somebody overcharged you, get Jesse.
Amazing.
And like the idea that Bob Ferguson has gotten Jesse for the entire state of Washington is maybe the single most brilliant PR hire I've ever heard of.
So, and he'll be running this org, government org that basically measures results and fixes government for the people of Washington, et cetera.
I don't know any of that. All I know is that it's like hiring Batman or like Sherlock Holmes to be in your government agency.
Okay. What department would you get drafted to if you were to join the dark side and work for government?
That would be a terrible recruitment process for state government, but I would probably be like the Debbie Downer department or something. Like, what is a journalist qualified for other than just poking holes in things and being a bummer?
I don't know if I would be good at working for government because I've dated several people who do, and it seems like there's so many meetings that could have been an email because they don't want to make emails because emails are public record. And meetings are off the record. And like reporters, I think a lot of people don't realize like we don't have the capacity. Like we don't have to go to a lot of meetings. We might have to cover them, but we don't have to go to meetings at work that often.
No, we're little divas.
We're divas. And I hate going to meetings. So I don't think I could do government.
First of all, Scott, we need to look into your dating history because that's for another podcast. But second of all, you know what couldn't be an email?
Sound Politics.
Sound Politics.
Welcome to Sound Politics, the podcast about this Washington, the other Washington, how they interact, how that affects you. I'm Scott Greenstone.
And I'm Libby Denkmann. And as we record this, President Trump, technically, has only been in office for, 72 hours?
Yeah, and between now and when you hear this, things could have changed a lot.
Totally. But our state is already feeling the shockwaves. So today we want to talk about how the president's flurry of executive orders, pardons, etc., have hit home here.
Yeah. In the state that warmed to him the least of any state last year.
Warmed to him a little bit.
But warmed to him a tiny bit.
Democratic leaders here are responding in all kinds of different ways. Some are suing him, some are speaking out. Others are maybe laying a little low or a little quieter than the last time around.
Yeah.
To get into all of this, we're joined today by two badass reporters who covered Trump and Washington the first time around, and they're back for more because they must be crazy. Jim Brunner with the Seattle Times and Melissa Santos with Axios Seattle. Thank you, Jim and Melissa. Thanks for being here.
Thanks.
Yeah,
that made me feel really old almost. But okay.
Well, let me say, I also covered him the first time
It
around,
doesn't
so
feel
it's
like
not
that
like
long
you're not
ago,
in
right?
that.
Okay,
You're in good company. It
That was
wasn't.
100 years ago.
I was
It was a
finishing
zillion
school
years
when
ago.
he got elected.
It both
so.
feels like forever ago and also yesterday.
Right.
Before we get into Trump, though, I want to, can we talk about just the vibe here in Washington State by going back to the weekend? As specifically, I'm thinking of the People's March was held here in Seattle. That's a rebrand of the Women's March to include, non-binary folks, trans folks, immigrants, other groups whose, local representatives are very worried about losing rights under Trump's second administration. But, if I compare it to the Women's March of 2017 in Seattle, it seems like it was a lot smaller. Jim, I want to start with you. What is the vibe of the so-called resistance now? Have people given up, or did they just give up on protesting?
Yeah, clearly there's, I think, an exhausted vibe, and you saw it in the fewer numbers of people out on the street compared with last time, and maybe people are waiting for the moment that galvanizes them. I do think that there can be moments that in the near future that would bring a lot more people out if you see the Trump administration follow through on some of the most extreme threats on how they might deport people, for example. I think it's going to be interesting to see what shape the new resistance, if it even is that, takes here.
It's interesting to look at, the Women's March was a response in some ways to, we just elected this guy who's on tape, the Access Hollywood
Grab
tape.
them by the blank. Yeah.
And the pussy hats and everything like that. Now it feels like maybe the threats are so far reaching. A lot of folks from a lot of different groups, it's almost like he's issuing so many executive orders and talking about going after so many sort of different groups, at least the folks that are representatives feel that way.
And that's by design in part. I read, I think an interesting, I don't know if it was an interview or just a story about how Stephen Miller, the powerful White House advisor who's very much in charge of the sort of the anti-immigration stance of the Trump administration, part of their strategy is to flood the zone.
Yes.
With just massive amounts of executive orders and statements and sort of, things that a lot of, Democrats and others in Washington would view as threats. And his view, from what I read, is that the resistance lacks the capacity this time around to respond to all that. And also the media sort of lacks the capacity, in diminished media lacks the capacity to sort of even cover all of it.
On that note, Bob Ferguson, now Governor Bob Ferguson, was at the People's March over the weekend, and he spoke a little bit. We have a cut to play.
Now, my job is different than it was the last time Donald Trump was president. But I can assure you, if this administration engages in any action that violates the law, that exceeds his authority, and harms your rights or the people of the state or our environment, I will stand up and we will stop him again.
Melissa, what do you hear there? I mean, resistance, resignation? What are you interpreting that as?
I think it's a lawyer talking a little bit, right? This was before the inauguration, right?
Yeah,
Time is
right.
such a flat circle.
Yeah,
right
weekends,
now,
yeah.
Right. So, I mean, I don't think that Bob or the new attorney general want to be, have their statements used against them when they're filing lawsuits later. I mean, technically, Bob's right. He's not going to be the one leading the lawsuit.
Like he was last time around as
right,
attorney general.
Exactly. But, I mean, if you're saying, we're out to get them, then later they're going to be say this is a prejudicial lawsuit that's just something. I mean, they can
An
use
axe
that
to
in
grind.
court, right? So we saw the few days before, we did stay sort of quiet, like you saw in Bob's inaugural address. I think you guys talked about this another podcast, so I won't go too in depth. But, he said, we will work with the Trump administration, but we will stand up to them when we must. And there was all these overtures to Republicans, and people are like, what's going on here? And I think that was part of that, too. So saying we are a reasonable people, and so if we stand up and say this is wrong, it's not just coming from a partisan place. It's coming from where we read the Constitution and we think that this goes against the Constitution. So they're kind of setting that up. And again, mind of a lawyer, they don't want other public statements to be used against them later when they anticipate filing lawsuits.
Jim, I think the transition has also felt different, the handoff between Biden and Trump. In the days leading up to the inauguration, we saw this flurry of pardons out of Biden's office. His family Tony Fauci, Liz Cheney, members of the January 6th committee. Biden also declared that the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, is now law, which seemed like something that had no teeth at all. Trump then...
Not true.
Yeah, it's not true. Trump then issued a series of pardons, of course, on the first day in office. All the January 6th rioters, commutations for some of those sentences as well. Then on Tuesday, we had the Ross Ulbricht pardon, which is the Silk Road guy who was, the creator of one of the largest drug marketplaces in U.S. history. He's been in jail for 10 years. He just got out. I mean, all of this, again, flurry, flood the zone situation. But what do you think it says about the principles driving the presidency in 2025?
Yeah, it feels like we, since Trump won, we've moved into a new era where the norms aren't even applying. And I would say, I don't want to make false equivalences, but even Joe Biden on his way out is doing some things that in the past I don't think he would have done, either as a younger person or in a different political era. You mentioned the Equal Rights Amendment. Whatever you said, it's now ratified as though he could declare that. It's not true. It's very confusing. I don't understand why he did it. I understand his justification for issuing the preemptive pardons, given Trump's penchant to actually be vengeful against people. But I also think it's a really bad look. I'm not sure it's great for the country to have preemptive pardons for people when you could make the case, or you could, if there was a factual investigation that found that Anthony Fauci did something horrible and violated the law. I don't think that most people would want him to be exempt just because the guy who was in the White House said so.
Of course, if we switch over to the pardons Trump issued on his first day in office, obviously there have been investigations into these January 6th rioters that he pardoned or commuted their sentences. Many of them were charged for violently assaulting police, including some local Pierce County men who are awaiting a verdict and have had their charges dismissed. And one local Seattle area Proud Boy leader, Ethan Nordine, who was serving 18 years for planning to overwhelm police barricades, seditious conspiracy, etc. He's now out of prison, my colleague Casey Martin tells me. So that's the other Washington. In that Washington, when Trump took office, he signed one executive order related to birthright citizenship, revoking or making an attempt to revoke it based on the grounds that folks born here to non-citizens should not receive the rights of citizenship. That's being challenged right here in Washington State by our Attorney General, Nick Brown. Melissa, do you think this is the first of many lawsuits? Why do you think Nick Brown filed this one? It looked like he was really prepared.
Well, they've been talking about being prepared for file lawsuits, essentially, if necessary, again, with that caveat, for like a year. And then if you ask now, they say they've been preparing for a year to potentially file lawsuits like this. So I think that we will see more lawsuits. And I think that there's something to be said that we seem to want to lead lawsuits in Washington State, given that we filed our own lawsuit, us and 3 other states, instead of just joining another one that was filed slightly earlier by 18 states, California and Massachusetts among them. So that says to me a little bit that while the Attorney General said, well, we have, harms that we think are unique to Washington State. We have people here that are harmed and they're different than people in Massachusetts. They're different people. Yes.
Yes.
But, I didn't really get a great explanation for why we had to file a separate lawsuit. And it might have just been they're working on separate tracks. They already had some briefs kind of in the works or something, I guess.
Could it be judge shopping?
That also, I think that's possible.
Getting a judge that kind of likes you a little bit more.
They did say that when I asked. They didn't say judge shopping. No, not precisely. They didn't say judge shopping. But, it was pointed out to me that it's common for, multiple lawsuits to maybe proceed in different jurisdictions, which was like code for judge shopping to me. But they did not say that.
Sure,
to be clear.
They don't want to come out and say it.
This is the awkward thing about this press conference that I went to with Nick Brown is journalists were asking, well, why? Why lead your own lawsuit? And he was like, well, there are unique harms, but he didn't really explain. And I mean, the undertone and the thing that Republicans are in this state are saying very explicitly is like, dude, you're trying to get a headline. You don't want to join the other lawsuit because you want to lead your own lawsuit. Do you all think that's true, Jim?
I mean, I think that when it's a politician and an elected official, you have to look at the political motivation, of course. I mean, very clearly, Bob Ferguson, when he was in the office, took advantage of the opportunity to generate headlines by filing. And he's a scorekeeper, Bob Ferguson. He'll tell you, he was keeping track of how many lawsuits he filed against the Trump administration. I think it wound up being 99. And I remember when he filed that first lawsuit back in the first Trump administration, he was very quick out of the gate, quicker than other states, to get the first lawsuit against the travel ban, the Muslim ban, for people traveling from predominantly Muslim countries. And he had his staff work, through the weekend, extreme hours, so that they would be able to be the first one to file it. Now, of course, that was successful. His legal argument was, proven correct on at least that initial travel ban. And I think that, you can look at the political motivation, but I also think that Nick Brown and Bob Ferguson have a genuine, true belief that they're correct here. And Trump's birthright citizenship order is going against a lot of precedent and seemingly plain language in the Constitution, at least how it's been treated up till now.
You talked about flooding the zone, Jim, and I think that the way this order sort of trickled out in public discourse speaks to that, because initially it was messaged as this is about the children of undocumented people, that they will not be able to have automatic birthright citizenship. Well, after 24 hours or so, you had legal scholars looking at this, and it's like, well, actually, it's people who are here on student visas, also people who are here on H-1B visas, things like that. So all of this has kind of been, slower to process through from when the order was issued. But we see it being a lot more widespread, potentially, for people in Washington state than just people who are here without authorization. I do think that there's an assumption that this is a fringe political theory to assume that there's a clause in the 14th Amendment that says if people are not subject to the jurisdiction thereof, that means, people who are not citizens will not, have birthright citizenship for their children. The assumption is it'll be overturned in court. A lot of people assuming that. Why bother here then? I mean, is there something else going on about the reason that this order is being issued by the Trump administration? I see you're skeptical, Jim, that you think this will be overturned. Yeah, say more.
No, I'm not skeptical. But,
okay.
But we've seen things that were previously thought to be maybe would never happen.
Yeah.
Including on abortion rights, things like that. And you've got a conservative court. You have a whole, a group of more conservative federal judges who might be more receptive in some states, maybe not here, to these kind of arguments. And I mean, this is how new precedents get set. You have a case, you throw it up in the courts, and sometimes you win.
Yeah. Melissa, do you have any take on that?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a political move. I mean, the flooding the zone, like Jim said, absolutely. But also, this is such a high-profile one. We're like, wait, that was an amendment the nation passed in response to slavery. Like, that is very specific. And it seems really outlandish in a lot of ways. So, yeah, I think filing that kind of obscures so he's telling all federal workers to go back to the office. Refugee programs. Okay, so the refugee admissions are suspended. Those are different orders, right? And there were dozens. So I do think that this one being so out there in the minds of legal scholars and basically everybody who has read the Constitution once or twice was designed to sort of obscure some of the other ones or sort of take some of the attention away from some of the other ones, which, include all these things, climate-related ones, like not giving subsidies for electric vehicles, I believe is one of them, and withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord and all of these other things. So I think that was by design a little bit.
Okay. So more executive orders. I want to talk about yet another on top of all of those that was signed Tuesday that could have a profound impact on Seattle. It's called Protecting the American People Against Invasion. But, Jim, what is in this order and why is it important here in Washington?
This is the order that tries to deny federal funding to any jurisdiction, cities or states or whoever, counties that have a sanctuary law where they're trying to say we won't cooperate with the federal government on deportations. That's a federal matter, and we're not going to have our local, police to work on that. And I think that this might be one of the reasons why people like Bob Ferguson and even Bruce Harrell, the mayor of Seattle, and others are being a little bit careful on their rhetoric out of the gate with Trump. Because one thing you know about Trump is if you catch his attention, like Jay Inslee tried to do often, not always successfully. I think Inslee would have liked to have catch Trump's attention more for his presidential bid.
Yeah.
Don't kiss the ring.
But the point is that I think they might be being careful about if Trump sees you and identifies you as a threat or somebody standing up to him, you're more likely to get the full weight of the Trump administration and maybe even the Justice Department, because I don't know if it's part of the order, but Trump has also issued or directed the Justice Department to actually investigate officials in jurisdictions that don't cooperate with his immigration agenda.
I wanted to ask you, Melissa, about this because you've been talking to officials that, about what happens if funding is pulled for sanctuary cities.
Well, they've seemed very prepared to potentially file lawsuits. I asked the mayor's office in Seattle about this a few weeks ago, and they said, a spokesperson told me there are strong constitutional protections in place that limit the federal government's ability to coerce cities by restricting funds. So that was saying, okay, so they've looked at this. They think that there's potentially grounds, if this happens, for them to sue potentially. And the state as well told me that they're ready to stand up to any sort of illegal, if they are illegal in their minds, cuts to congressional appropriations for Washington. And they said, especially if they're politically motivated, they're on the lookout for that, right? For any politically motivated cuts to them. And, we have not only a sanctuary state law, but Seattle's had something on the books for more than 20 years restricting local police from asking about immigration status. Our state passed a law during the previous Trump administration that really limits state and local police from asking about immigration status or helping ICE in certain specific ways. So we would be a target potentially if this order plays out the way it reads, like it might.
And what kinds of things, are we talking HUD funding, HHS stuff? Like, how widespread could that be if federal funding is cut off? Like, how bad is that, Jim?
It sounds like it could be everything. They're just saying to the extent possible, they would try to deny funding. There's a whole swath of other potential Trump and Republican Congress efforts to maybe deny funding to states that they don't like politically or that, in their view, are doing things that are, maybe harmful to the public from their political view. You've seen the Speaker of the House say that we're going to put conditions on disaster aid to California, for example. So that's going to be something that could be a real, knockdown fight in the courts. And then on the immigration issue, I think that another big concern is if it gets really heated and if the Trump administration is taking action on the streets and there's protests, you have this perspective, the prospect of him trying to activate the National Guard or send troops here. It could get really ugly. Beyond the money.
The tone that we're talking about is different. It is palpable just because I'm looking at headlines from 2017, this time in 2017, where Seattle Mayor Ed Murray is saying, I'm willing to lose every single penny to protect immigrants. And that is not the vibe I'm getting from any Democrat
Bruce
here
Harrell,
in the state now.
Anybody, yeah. You do notice some governors, like J.B. Pritzker in Illinois, is saying we are not going to follow the birthright citizenship order, like straight up saying that. So not all Democrats have sort of softened their tone, but we're not hearing that right now from Democrats in Washington state. Let's move on really quick because I want to get to the DEI changes, that anti-discrimination policy changes, and really kind of trying to root out DEI that Trump introduced this week. He's ended LBJ's 1965 order that federal contractors have to take affirmative action to end discrimination at their firms. He's ordered federal employees to inform on efforts to hide DEI work in the federal workforce. He suspended the federal DEI workers. And it goes beyond federal contractors. There is language in some of these orders asking federal agency heads to identify civil compliance investigations. So corporations that have DEI policies, investigate them if they are engaging in what the Trump orders frame as illegal discriminatory practices. Because that's the shift in language here, right? This federal language now is that DEI practices are illegal discriminatory practices. Jim or Melissa, I'm thinking about big corporations here who have not backed off of DEI work, like Microsoft, Costco. Microsoft's a huge federal contractor. Any ideas about questions or ways that this could play out locally?
Jim pointed to Melissa.
Man, this is one I'm not really clear how you enforce it on private companies in the same way. We in Washington state have had sort of an anti-affirmative action policy on the books for decades, and that was really focused on, government for the most part, but also
public universities.
Yeah. So, does Costco have contracts with are they giving pizzas? Like, are they going to have contracts with
I don't know about
government?
Costco as a federal contractor, but
Right.
I mean, the vibe is that the Trump administration wants to go after the federal workforce, certainly federal contractors, but then they are looking at potential investigations of also private companies. That this could be a lever, yes, in the federal workforce, and for a Microsoft, for example, that has a huge amount of contracts with the government, that they will be pressured to change their policies, but that there are also the possibility of these investigations, which would go way further, like basically just a total cooling of the environment of DEI and having that work go either underground or disappear.
And wasn't there a numeric in at least one of the orders? There was a couple orders to sort of look into and start investigations in various areas. And at least one of them had sort of a numeric, like, identify this many.
9. It was
right?
identified
and so
9 civil compliance investigations.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and it was the DEI one. This is what I mean. It's hard to even keep track, even if you're following this, because there are so many, which is the flooding the zone, right? But that's a very specific, directive. It's not just look around and see. It's like, come back to me with 9. So I do think that there is at least an attempt to branch out to private companies more. I don't know how effective that can be. I guess I was saying, I get that they're trying to do that, but how do you do that? I mean, it seems like in general, they've been trying to not interfere with companies' internal business dealings. So this seems to be maybe flying in the face of that a little. It's a little confusing. So I think we have to wait and see a little.
And let's not forget one of our biggest, maybe other than Microsoft, maybe above Microsoft, government contractors in this state, Boeing. They got rid of their DEI staff before the election even happened. You
think that was preemptive knowing? I mean, to some extent?
No, I think it's
budget
a change in
cuts.
culture and
Yeah.
budget
Well, they've
cuts.
had a lot of stuff going on at Boeing.
Yeah, they've had a lot of layoffs overall.
Before we go, I have one final question for both of you. We're already drinking from a water hose that is flooding the zone. How many metaphors can I stitch together here when it comes to, presidential news right now? It's only been 3 days, like we said. It feels like it was a
week, and I realized
so tired.
Lemon, it's Wednesday. It's Thursday. Sorry. Okay, so we've been here before. We're wiser. We're more in touch with ourselves than 8 years ago. What are you doing to tune out the news when you need to block out everything that's happening? When you can't take any more of the fire hose, how do you escape?
It is only 3 days, so I haven't totally figured out my strategy yet. But the inauguration day, I actually just took some friends who were in town, up to the Space Needle. My kid had never been up there because it costs $1 zillion to go up to the Space Needle. So we finally did it.
Yeah.
Right? I stood on the little... This is new since I last went up there, which was a gajillion years ago. They have a rotating glass floor thing. I got totally freaked out. So I'm just trying to do normal things. I just didn't listen to the inauguration at the time and followed up on it later. And I've also been just zeroing in on state politics. I'm a bill about blah, blah, blah. I'm going to write about that. That's really my focus anyway. And that's, I guess, part of my strategy. Space Needle dollars spent.
And
Trying to do
spinning.
normal things. That
Right.
sounds like a plan. I personally can't tune any of it out. I am mainlining it. It's really unhealthy, but I can't. And I should have learned from last time around, but I never will.
I also like to try to focus on what we can sort of cover here locally.
Right.
Yeah.
And not make everything. I personally think it's been bad for a long time now that it feels like everybody in America has to think about the president all the time. And it didn't used to be that way. And I don't think it's good for the country or for our psyche. So
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff happening. There's a city government. There's actually an election, in a couple weeks in Seattle. I'm going to try and focus on that stuff as a reporter a little bit because there is a lot of coverage already of the federal stuff, including in my own organization. But I feel like I can add more value. There's a legislative session happening, that's happening. And also maybe looking at the city hall and certainly there's going to be ripple effects from all this federal stuff. That's what we've been talking about this whole time. But they're also just doing stuff that's important locally, talking about the weapons police can use on crowds, stuff like that,
Yeah.
Rent increase caps, things like that.
I heard about that last week. It's other
We're
things.
going to be talking about that election you mentioned next week.
Social housing,
on the show.
on Sound Politics. Melissa Santos, Jim Brunner, it's such a pleasure to have you both in studio. Jim Brunner writes for the Seattle Times, Melissa Santos for Axios Seattle. Thank you very much. We are at the top of the roller coaster. It's only beginning, but we appreciate all of your reporting and keeping us grounded and informed and, I think, centered at this time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Before we go today, we have a question for everybody listening. How are you handling this fire hose of information? Do you want to hear about what Trump is up to every single episode on Sound Politics? Are you getting too much Trump? Are you getting enough national news elsewhere? Let us know what you're interested in hearing about from the show in the weeks and months ahead. Leave us an email at soundpolitics@kuow.org. And thanks.
That's it for Sound Politics. Today our show was produced by Sarah Leibovitz. Our editor is Gabe Spitzer. I'm Scott Greenstone.
Our inspiration, of course, is Jesse Jones. I'm Libby Denkmann. Please consider a donation. The link is in the show notes or at kuow.org/politics to keep Sound Politics going strong. We'll catch you next week on the next episode of Sound Politics.
See ya.